Sometimes the people who save your life are the ones barely surviving their own. Snow pressed against the cracked windshield while Emily Carter pulled her thin coat tighter around her 6-year-old daughter in the front seat of their old Honda Civic. The temperature outside had already dropped below 20 degrees, and the car's heater had stopped working almost a week ago. Lily was asleep beside her, curled beneath 2 faded blankets with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Emily stared at the pharmacy receipt in her trembling hand and tried not to cry. $43. That was all she needed for Lily's inhaler refill, and somehow it still felt impossible. Earlier that morning, Emily had worked a 7-hour breakfast shift at Rosie's Diner, smiling at customers who never looked twice at her tired eyes. Then she spent 4 hours delivering groceries around downtown Chicago in a car that rattled every time she touched the brakes. Even after both jobs, she still didn't have enough money to pay for the motel room they'd been staying in. The manager had knocked on her door an hour ago and told her she needed to leave immediately unless she could pay another 2 nights in advance. She had begged for more time, but he only sighed and avoided eye contact. People stopped listening when they realized you were poor. Emily leaned her head against the steering wheel and closed her eyes for a second. Her entire body ached from exhaustion. She hadn't eaten since the free muffin she grabbed at the diner before sunrise, but she had told Lily she wasn't hungry anyway. Mothers lied like that all the time. A small cough suddenly broke the silence. Emily looked over instantly. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered softly. Lily blinked awake slowly, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Are we home yet?" Emily forced a smile, even though the question nearly shattered her heart. "Not yet, baby, but we're okay." Lily nodded sleepily before reaching for Emily's hand. "I'm sorry I'm sick all the time." Emily's expression fell immediately. "No, don't ever say that." She brushed loose blonde hair away from Lily's face. "None of this is your fault." Outside the car, snow continued falling across the empty parking lot behind a closed grocery store. Emily checked the gas gauge again. Less than a quarter tank left. If she kept the engine running for heat, they wouldn't have enough fuel tomorrow. But if she turned it off, Lily would freeze during the night. Emily swallowed hard and looked at her sleeping daughter again. Every decision felt impossible lately. Across the city, giant digital billboards suddenly lit up the dark streets with the face of a man the entire country recognized instantly. Alexander Hayes, billionaire CEO, youngest tech founder to ever make the Forbes list. The headlines beneath his cold gray eyes flashed across the screens in giant white letters. America's most feared billionaire returns after months of seclusion. Emily barely glanced at it at first, too consumed by her own problems to care about another rich man in a suit. But then the news anchor's voice drifted faintly from a nearby electronics store window. Sources say Hayes has not appeared publicly since the mysterious car accident that left him partially disabled last year. Emily looked up briefly. The photo showed a handsome man in a wheelchair exiting a black SUV while surrounded by security guards. His expression looked empty, angry even, like someone who hated the entire world. "Why does he look so sad?" Lily asked quietly, still half asleep. Emily stared at the screen for another second before answering. "Maybe money doesn't fix everything." At that exact moment, miles away inside a glass penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago, Alexander Hayes sat completely alone in the dark while another untouched dinner grew cold beside him. Some people are surrounded by luxury and still feel completely alone. Alexander Hayes sat motionless beside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse while the Chicago skyline disappeared beneath heavy snow. The city below looked alive with movement and warmth, but inside the $30 million apartment, everything felt cold and silent. A fire burned quietly across the room, untouched whiskey rested on the table beside him, and soft classical music played somewhere in the background, yet none of it reached him anymore. 3 months earlier, Alexander had been photographed on magazine covers beside politicians, celebrities, and athletes. Reporters used to follow him everywhere. Investors called him a genius. Women chased him. Entire companies feared him. Now most days he barely spoke to anyone at all. The wheelchair beneath him felt like a prison he could not escape. His fingers tightened slowly against the armrest as pain crawled through his lower back again. The doctors called it nerve damage caused by the accident, but Alexander hated every explanation they gave him because none of them changed anything. Every morning, he woke up hoping his body would feel different, and every morning disappointment hit him before his feet even touched the floor. A nervous voice suddenly interrupted the silence. "Sir, you should try to eat something." Alexander did not look away from the window. His private nurse stood near the dining table holding a tray of untouched food. "Leave it there," he said coldly. "You skipped lunch too," she replied carefully. "The medication could make you sick on an empty stomach." Alexander finally turned toward her, his sharp gray eyes exhausted but intimidating enough to make people instantly uncomfortable. "Did I ask for advice?" The nurse lowered her gaze immediately. "No, sir." "Then stop talking." She quietly placed the tray down and hurried toward the elevator without another word. Alexander exhaled slowly once she disappeared. Another caregiver gone. Another person walking on eggshells around him. He hated the pity in their eyes more than anything. The truth was, he barely recognized himself anymore either. Before the accident, Alexander used to sleep 4 hours a night and spend the rest building one of the largest tech companies in America. He controlled billion-dollar deals from private jets while speaking at conferences around the world. He lived for pressure, for control, for winning. But ever since the crash on that rainy California highway, something inside him had changed. The nightmares still woke him up almost every night. Loud noises made his chest tighten. Crowded rooms felt unbearable. Sometimes even breathing became difficult for reasons he could not explain. His therapist called it trauma. Alexander called it weakness. Suddenly, another sharp pain shot through his leg, forcing him to grip the wheel of his chair harder. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing through it. The frustration was worse than the pain itself. He used to run 6 miles every morning before sunrise. Now standing up without assistance felt impossible. His phone buzzed on the table nearby. Another message from the board of directors. Another reminder that people were waiting to see whether Alexander Hayes would ever fully recover. He ignored it. Outside, snow continued falling over the city while millions of people watched news coverage about his return to public life. Most of them imagined a powerful billionaire hidden inside luxury. None of them knew how dark the silence became after midnight. Alexander slowly rolled himself toward the kitchen before stopping halfway as another wave of dizziness hit him unexpectedly. His breathing suddenly became uneven. Fast. Tight. Familiar panic spread through his chest without warning. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. He reached for the counter, trying to steady himself, but the walls already felt like they were closing in around him. Downstairs in the lobby at that exact moment, Emily Carter stepped inside the building carrying a paper delivery bag while snow melted from her worn sneakers onto the marble floor. The strangest moments in life happen when two broken people meet at exactly the wrong time. Emily adjusted the insulated delivery bag against her shoulder as she stepped through the massive glass doors of Hayes Tower. Warm air immediately wrapped around her frozen skin, making her realize just how cold she had been outside. The lobby looked more like a luxury hotel than an apartment building. Marble floors reflected golden chandelier lights overhead, and a giant Christmas tree stood near the center fountain covered in silver ornaments and white roses. Emily suddenly felt embarrassed by her worn jeans and cheap winter coat. Even her sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished floor. A security guard behind the front desk glanced at her delivery bag before speaking into an earpiece. "Food delivery for penthouse level," he said. Emily shifted nervously. "I just need a signature, and then I will be gone." The guard nodded toward a private elevator. "Someone will escort you upstairs." A tall man in a black suit appeared moments later. He looked exhausted, like he had not slept properly in weeks. "You are from Midtown Bistro?" he asked quickly. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. Come with me." They entered the elevator in silence. As the doors closed, Emily noticed the man checking his phone repeatedly with growing concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked politely. The man hesitated before answering. "Not really." The elevator opened directly into an enormous penthouse apartment surrounded by dark windows and city lights. Emily barely had time to take in the view before she heard something crash loudly somewhere deeper inside the residence. The suited man cursed under his breath and rushed forward immediately. "Mr. Hayes," he called out. Another loud sound echoed through the apartment. Emily instinctively followed him around the corner and froze at the scene in front of her. Alexander Hayes sat in his wheelchair near the kitchen island, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. A glass lay shattered on the floor beside him. His breathing sounded uneven and strained, and sweat covered his forehead despite the cold room. One of the house staff stood nearby, looking completely panicked. I tried calling the doctor. The woman whispered nervously. He will not let anyone near him. Do not touch me. Alexander snapped harshly when the suited man stepped closer. His voice sounded different now, less controlled, more afraid. Emily watched his chest rise rapidly as his eyes darted around the room like he could not catch his breath. She had seen panic attacks before. Lily's father used to have them after losing his construction job years ago. Back then, Emily learned that fear could make even the strongest people look helpless. Sir, you need to calm down, the assistant urged carefully. Please stop talking, Alexander suddenly shouted. The room fell silent instantly. Emily could see it happening now. The trembling hands, the distant stare, the feeling of drowning inside your own mind. Without thinking too much about it, she slowly placed the food bag onto the counter and stepped forward carefully. Hey, she said softly. Everyone turned toward her in shock. Alexander's eyes immediately locked onto hers. You are breathing too fast, Emily continued gently. You are okay. Nothing bad is happening right now. Do not, Alexander whispered through clenched teeth. Tell me I am okay. Emily ignored the anger in his voice. Instead, she crouched slightly beside his wheelchair so he did not have to look up at her. Then do not focus on being okay, she said quietly. Just focus on one breath at a time. Alexander stared at her in confusion. Emily slowly inhaled once. Like this. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Then, surprisingly, Alexander's breathing began slowing slightly. Not completely, but enough for the tension in his shoulders to ease. Emily kept her voice calm. That is it. One breath. Alexander continued staring at her like he was trying to understand why her presence suddenly made the room feel less suffocating. Nearly a full minute passed before his breathing finally steadied enough for him to speak again. The assistant looked stunned. That has never worked before, he muttered quietly. Emily stood back up awkwardly. I should probably go. But before she could reach for the delivery bag receipt, Alexander suddenly spoke without taking his eyes off her. Wait. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones least willing to ask for it. Emily stopped near the kitchen counter with her hand still wrapped around the delivery receipt while Alexander Hayes stared at her from across the room. The panic in his expression had faded slightly, but tension still lingered in his sharp features. Nobody else spoke. Even the staff looked confused by what had just happened. Alexander was known for throwing people out of his home over the smallest inconvenience. Yet now he was watching a tired delivery woman like she was the only thing keeping the room steady. Emily shifted awkwardly beneath the silence. I really should get back, she said carefully. My daughter is waiting for me. Alexander lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. How did you do that? Emily blinked. Do what? Make it stop. His voice sounded quieter now, stripped of the cold authority everyone else feared. Emily glanced toward the assistant and then back at Alexander. I did not make anything stop, she answered honestly. You calmed yourself down. Alexander leaned back slightly in his wheelchair like he did not believe her. Doctors have been trying for months. Doctors are not always the people you need in moments like that, Emily replied softly. The assistant suddenly stepped forward. Mr. Hayes, maybe she could stay for a little while. Alexander did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Emily, as though he was studying something unfamiliar. What is your name? He asked finally. Emily Carter. Do you always talk to strangers like that? Emily almost smiled. Only the terrifying billionaires. For the first time all evening, something close to amusement flickered across Alexander's face before disappearing again. The assistant looked stunned by the interaction. I am Daniel, by the way, he said quickly to Emily. Mr. Hayes's executive assistant. Emily nodded politely. Nice to meet you. Daniel hesitated before lowering his voice. Would you consider staying for dinner? Mr. Hayes has not eaten properly in days. Emily immediately shook her head. I cannot. My little girl is alone in the car downstairs. Alexander's expression changed slightly. In the car. Emily instantly regretted saying it aloud. It is temporary, she explained quickly. We are just between places right now. Daniel looked horrified. You and your child are sleeping in your car during this weather? Emily crossed her arms defensively. I am handling it. Alexander remained silent for several long seconds before turning toward Daniel. How much was the food order? Daniel checked the receipt. $78. Alexander reached for his wallet and removed several $100 bills without hesitation. Emily stared at the money in disbelief. I cannot take that. You can? Alexander replied flatly. Consider it payment for helping me breathe. Emily shook her head again. I was just being human. Most people around me stopped acting human months ago. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, the billionaire sitting in front of her no longer looked powerful or untouchable. He simply looked exhausted. Broken even. Emily slowly accepted part of the money, but handed most of it back. This is enough. Alexander frowned slightly. Take all of it. I said enough. Daniel looked between them nervously, probably unaccustomed to anyone refusing Alexander Hayes directly. Surprisingly, Alexander did not argue further. Instead, he studied her with growing curiosity. You are different, he muttered quietly. Emily let out a tired laugh. Trust me, being broke is not that interesting. That is not what I meant. Their eyes held for a brief moment before Emily quickly looked away. She suddenly became aware of how late it was getting. Lily was probably freezing downstairs. I really need to go, she said softly. Alexander nodded once, though disappointment flashed briefly across his face. Daniel walked her toward the elevator while the penthouse fell silent again behind them. Just before the elevator doors closed, Alexander spoke one last time from across the room. Emily. She looked back at him. If you ever need help, he said slowly, come back here first. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the elevator doors slid shut before she could say anything at all. Life becomes dangerous when hope shows up after you already gave up on finding it. Emily sat inside the parked Honda Civic with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of cheap coffee while snow continued falling outside the grocery store parking lot. Lily slept peacefully beside her, finally warm after eating the grilled cheese sandwich Emily bought with part of Alexander's money. For the first time in weeks, her daughter was not coughing in her sleep. Emily should have felt relieved, but instead her mind kept replaying the strange encounter inside the penthouse. She could still see Alexander Hayes staring at her with those tired gray eyes, like he had been drowning quietly for months, and suddenly someone handed him air. Emily shook the thought away. Men like him did not belong in the same world as women like her. Billionaires solved problems with money. People like Emily survived problems one overdue bill at a time. Her phone suddenly buzzed against the dashboard. An unknown number flashed across the screen. Emily hesitated before answering. Hello. Emily, this is Daniel, Mr. Hayes' assistant. She straightened immediately. Did something happen? Not exactly, Daniel replied carefully. But Mr. Hayes asked me to contact you. Emily frowned slightly. How did you even get my number? The delivery app. She leaned back against the seat. Okay, what does he need? Daniel paused briefly. He wants to make you an offer. Emily almost laughed from exhaustion. I am not interested in becoming some billionaire's personal therapist. It is not like that. Then what is it like? Daniel lowered his voice. Mr. Hayes has refused every medical specialist, physical therapist, and caregiver we have hired since the accident. Tonight was the first time in months he calmed down without medication. Emily glanced toward Lily sleeping beside her. I do not know anything about trauma therapy. Maybe that is exactly why it worked. Emily stayed quiet. Daniel continued carefully. He wants you to spend a few hours a day with him this week. Doing what? Talking. Keeping him company. Helping him manage the panic episodes. Emily stared through the windshield at the falling snow. Why would he trust a complete stranger? Honestly, Daniel sighed softly. I think because you treated him like a human being instead of a billionaire. Emily felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest. Before she could answer, Lily suddenly began coughing hard in the passenger seat. Emily immediately turned toward her daughter. Hey, baby, slow breaths. Lily struggled for air between coughs while Emily searched frantically through her purse for the nearly empty inhaler. Fear rushed through her instantly. Come on, she whispered desperately. She helped Lily use the inhaler, but the wheezing barely improved this time. Daniel's voice remained faintly on the phone. Emily, are you there? She swallowed hard before answering. My daughter needs a doctor. What hospital? Daniel asked immediately. Emily hesitated. I cannot afford another emergency room bill. That was not my question. 20 minutes later, Emily sat inside a private hospital room in complete disbelief while a pediatric doctor examined Lily carefully. Warm blankets covered the bed, cartoons played softly on the television, and a nurse had already brought juice and crackers for Lily. Emily still did not fully understand how any of this happened so quickly. Daniel stood near the doorway with his hands folded professionally in front of him. Mr. Hayes arranged everything, he explained quietly. Emily looked down at her daughter, whose breathing had finally started stabilizing again. Emotion burned behind her eyes. Why would he do this for us? Daniel's expression softened slightly. Because after meeting you tonight, he actually ate dinner for the first time in days. Emily looked away immediately, overwhelmed by the weight behind those words. A few minutes later, Daniel carefully placed a business card onto the bedside table beside her. Mr. Hayes would like to see you again tomorrow. Emily stared at the card silently. And if I say no? Daniel gave a small tired smile. Then I think he will spend the entire night staring out his penthouse window waiting for you to change your mind. The hardest thing about accepting help is wondering when the kindness will disappear. Emily barely slept that night inside the hospital chair beside Lily's bed. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind drifted back to Alexander Hayes and the strange feeling she got whenever he looked at her. It was not attraction. Not yet. It was something sadder than that. Like seeing someone surrounded by everything money could buy while still looking completely lost. Early the next morning, Lily sat up in bed eating pancakes from the hospital cafeteria with far more energy than she had shown in weeks. Her blonde curls bounced slightly as she smiled. "Mommy, this syrup tastes fancy." Emily laughed softly for the first time in days. "I think that is because it actually came from a Real bottle instead of the dollar store." Lily grinned before lowering her voice dramatically. "Was that rich guy the one who paid for this place?" Emily nearly choked on her coffee. "Lily, what? He looked like Batman." Emily shook her head while trying not to smile. "He is just someone who helped us. Because he likes you. He does not even know me." Lily shrugged confidently. "Men are weird." Before Emily could respond, a gentle knock sounded at the hospital room door. Daniel stepped inside wearing another perfectly pressed black suit. "Good morning." Emily immediately became tense again. "You really do not waste time." Daniel smiled politely. "Mr. Hayes does not sleep much these days." He handed Emily a small envelope. Inside was a temporary apartment key card and several printed documents. Emily frowned in confusion. "What is this?" "A furnished guest apartment owned by Hayes Industries. 2 bedrooms. Utilities included." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "No, it is not charity," Daniel said quickly. "Mr. Hayes wants to officially hire you." Emily looked back down at the paperwork. The salary listed on the contract made her stomach tighten. It was more money than she had earned in an entire year working multiple jobs. "This cannot be real. You would spend afternoons with him at the penthouse. That is all." Emily narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "People like Alexander Hayes do not pay strangers this much just to talk." Daniel hesitated carefully before answering. "You saw him last night. He is not doing well." Emily looked away silently. "The doctors believe isolation is making his condition worse," Daniel continued. "But whenever he is around you, he becomes calmer. You are talking about me like I am some kind of medication." "Honestly," Daniel sighed tiredly. "Right now you might be the closest thing he has." Emily hated how guilty those words made her feel. She had spent years barely surviving on her own. Becoming emotionally responsible for a billionaire with trauma issues sounded like the worst possible decision. Yet every time she looked at Lily smiling in that warm hospital bed, reality hit her again. Her daughter needed stability. Safety. A real home. "How long?" Emily asked quietly. 30 days to start. "And after that?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "That depends on both of you." Later that afternoon, Emily stood once again inside the giant penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago while Lily held tightly onto her hand beside her. The apartment looked less intimidating during daylight, though the silence still felt heavy. Alexander sat near the windows in a dark sweater with paperwork spread across the table beside him. When he looked up and saw Emily enter, something immediately softened in his expression. Then his eyes moved toward Lily. "You brought your daughter." Lily waved shyly. "Hi, Batman." Daniel nearly choked behind them while Emily covered her face in embarrassment. But to everyone's shock, Alexander let out a quiet laugh. A real one. Small, rough, and unfamiliar, like a sound he had not made in a very long time. A person can survive sadness for a long time, but kindness changes everything. The sound of Lily's laughter echoed through the penthouse while Alexander Hayes watched from the kitchen with an expression nobody in the apartment had seen in months. Emily stood beside the marble counter, helping Lily decorate cookies with colorful frosting left over from the chef's holiday catering tray. Somehow, within less than an hour, the giant cold penthouse already felt different. Warmer. Human. Lily held up a cookie covered in uneven red icing. This one looks like a dinosaur accident. Emily laughed softly. That is because you used half the frosting container. Art takes sacrifice. Alexander unexpectedly let out another quiet laugh from behind them, and Daniel nearly dropped the tablet he was holding. Emily glanced toward Alexander in surprise. His face still looked tired, and dark circles rested beneath his eyes, but there was something softer in him now whenever he looked at Lily. Like her presence interrupted the constant storm inside his head. Do you want one? Lily asked him suddenly, holding out the messy cookie proudly. Alexander stared at it for a second. That might be the ugliest cookie I have ever seen. Lily gasped dramatically. Mommy, he insulted my art. Emily folded her arms. You should apologize to the chef. Alexander shook his head slowly, though the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Fine. I apologize. Lily handed him the cookie anyway. Alexander hesitated before taking a small bite. For a brief moment, Emily noticed something fragile pass across his expression. Something almost peaceful. Good? Lily asked. Terrible, he answered. But somehow still better than most things I eat. Emily smiled faintly before turning back toward the counter. The interaction should have felt ordinary, but for Alexander it was anything but ordinary. The penthouse had been silent for so long that even simple laughter sounded unfamiliar now. Later that afternoon, Lily fell asleep on the oversized living room couch wrapped beneath a soft blanket while snow drifted outside the giant windows. Emily quietly adjusted the blanket around her daughter before noticing Alexander watching from across the room. What? She asked softly. Alexander looked away first. Nothing. Emily walked toward the fireplace slowly. You keep doing that. Doing what? Looking at us like you were trying to remember something. Alexander stayed silent for a moment before answering. I forgot what normal people sound like. Emily leaned lightly against the chair across from him. You act like you have been trapped in here for 10 years. Feels longer. His voice carried exhaustion beneath every word. Emily studied him carefully now that the anger from their first meeting had faded slightly. Without the expensive suits and headlines, Alexander no longer seemed intimidating. He seemed lonely. Deeply lonely. Can I ask you something? She said carefully. Most people ask me things without permission. Why are you really hiding from the world? Alexander's jaw tightened immediately. Emily regretted the question at first, but then he surprised her again. Because the world only respects strong people, he answered quietly. And after the accident, I stopped feeling strong. Emily looked down briefly before speaking. You know what I think? Probably something annoying. I think you are exhausted from pretending you are not scared. Alexander stared at her sharply. Nobody spoke to him this honestly anymore. Employees feared him. Doctors monitored him. Reporters judged him. But Emily simply looked at him like a man instead of a headline. Fear changes people, she continued softly. It does not make them weak. Alexander's eyes lingered on her face longer this time. The firelight reflected gently across her blonde hair, while exhaustion still shadowed her features. She looked nothing like the women usually surrounding billionaires. No designer clothes. No fake charm. Just honesty. Real honesty. Suddenly, pain shot sharply through Alexander's lower back again. His hand tightened instantly against the wheelchair armrest. Emily noticed immediately. You okay? I am fine. That means no. Alexander exhaled slowly through his teeth while trying to shift his weight. Emily stepped closer carefully. Have you done your physical therapy today? I fired my therapist. Why? Because he treated me like a broken machine. Emily crossed her arms. Well, right now you are acting like a stubborn toddler. For a second Alexander looked offended. Then unexpectedly, another quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Upstairs security cameras silently captured the moment while, somewhere inside the building, another pair of unseen eyes watched the footage with growing irritation. The most dangerous secrets are the ones hidden behind smiles and expensive suits. 3 days passed inside the penthouse, And for the first time in nearly a year, Alexander Hayes began following an actual routine again. He ate breakfast when Emily reminded him. He attended virtual board meetings without shutting the laptop halfway through. He even allowed a physical therapist to visit once, though he complained through the entire session while Lily giggled from the couch nearby. The apartment no longer felt frozen in grief. Small sounds had returned to the rooms. Coffee brewing in the mornings. Cartoons playing softly in the afternoons. Lily's tiny sneakers squeaking across the marble floors. Emily noticed the changes in Alexander before he noticed them himself. The dark tension around him eased slightly each day. He still woke from nightmares sometimes, and panic still flashed across his face unexpectedly, but now he no longer hid alone in dark rooms afterward. Somehow, without either of them planning it, Emily and Lily had become part of his life frighteningly fast. One snowy evening, Emily stood in the penthouse kitchen washing dishes while Alexander reviewed paperwork nearby. Lily sat on the floor drawing with colored pencils beside the fireplace. The moment almost looked normal. Domestic, even. "You missed a spot," Alexander muttered while watching Emily rinse a plate. Emily rolled her eyes immediately. "You are a billionaire. Why are you even noticing dishes?" "Because you are terrible at this. I am adding soap dramatically for artistic effect." Lily suddenly looked up from her drawing. "Mommy, rich people flirt weird." Emily nearly dropped the plate while Alexander coughed into his coffee, trying to hide another laugh. "Nobody is flirting," Emily said quickly. Lily shrugged. "Batman smiles more when you are here." The room fell strangely quiet after that. Emily focused on the sink while Alexander looked away toward the city lights outside the windows. Neither of them knew how to respond because the child had unknowingly spoken the truth. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep in the guest room upstairs, Emily walked back into the living room and found Alexander alone near the fireplace, staring at old documents spread across the table. His expression looked colder again. "You okay?" she asked softly. Alexander tapped one paper with his finger. "These are accident reports." Emily stepped closer carefully. "From the crash?" He nodded once. Something about them never made sense. Emily sat down across from him while scanning the papers. Insurance statements, vehicle inspections, police timelines. Everything looked official, yet Alexander's face remained tense. "The brakes failed on a perfectly maintained car," he said quietly. Then somehow the security footage from the highway disappeared. Emily frowned slightly. "You think someone caused it?" "I think powerful people protect themselves." His voice turned bitter. "And there were people who benefited from me disappearing." Emily looked down at the company reports spread beside the accident files. One name appeared repeatedly. Victor Hayes. Alexander noticed her eyes stop there. "My father's son from his second marriage," he explained coldly. "He became acting CO while I recovered." "Do you trust him?" Alexander gave a humorless smile. "I trust him to enjoy power." Before Emily could respond, voices suddenly echoed faintly from the hallway outside the penthouse entrance. Alexander's expression darkened instantly. Daniel was not supposed to let anyone up tonight. Seconds later, the front doors opened and a tall man in an expensive navy coat stepped inside confidently without waiting for permission. He looked younger than Alexander, but his sharp smile carried the same intensity. "Brother," the man said smoothly while removing leather gloves. "I heard you finally stopped hiding from civilization." Alexander's entire posture stiffened. "Victor." Victor's eyes slowly shifted toward Emily, standing near the table, then toward the hallway where Lily slept upstairs. Something unreadable flashed briefly across his expression before the smile returned. "Interesting," he said quietly. "So the rumors are true." Emily immediately felt the atmosphere in the room change. The warmth from earlier vanished almost instantly. Victor stepped closer toward Alexander while keeping his calm, polished smile. "The board is starting to wonder whether your little recovery miracle is real," he continued. "And now suddenly there is a woman and child living in your penthouse." Alexander's voice turned ice cold. "Leave." But Victor only glanced toward Emily one more time before speaking softly enough to sound almost polite. "Be careful who you trust, brother. Sometimes strangers enter your life for reasons you do not see yet. The people who heal you often become the people you fear losing the most." After Victor Hayes left the penthouse that night, the silence inside the apartment felt heavier than before. Snow drifted quietly outside the windows while Emily stood near the fireplace, trying to understand the tension she had just witnessed. Alexander remained motionless in his wheelchair, staring toward the closed front doors long after his brother disappeared. His jaw stayed tight, and the warmth that had slowly returned to him over the past few days suddenly seemed buried beneath old anger again. "You never told me your brother worked with you," Emily said carefully. Alexander gave a bitter smile. "I never said we worked together. He seemed threatened by you." "Victor is threatened by losing control." Emily sat down slowly across from him. "Do you really think he had something to do with the accident?" Alexander looked toward the city lights without answering immediately. "I think people become dangerous when power is involved." His voice sounded distant now, exhausted. Emily studied him quietly. For all his money and influence, Alexander still looked like a man trapped inside something painful he could not fully escape. "Then maybe you should stop facing it alone," she said softly. Alexander turned toward her slowly. Their eyes held for a long moment before he looked away first. Almost like the honesty in her voice unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. Upstairs, Lily suddenly called out sleepily from the guest room. "Mommy." Emily stood immediately. "I should check on her." As she turned toward the hallway, Alexander spoke quietly behind her. "Stay tonight." Emily paused. "Alexander, I am not asking for anything complicated." His voice remained calm, but vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. "The apartment feels different when you are here." Emily's chest tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had needed her like this in a very long time. Not for money, not for convenience, but for comfort, for peace. She looked back at him carefully. "You cannot depend on me for everything." Alexander lowered his eyes briefly. "I know," but somehow the sadness in those two words felt deeper than anything else he could have said. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the penthouse windows while Lily sat cross-legged on the floor coloring pictures beside Alexander's wheelchair. Emily walked out of the kitchen carrying coffee and froze slightly at the sight in front of her. Alexander was helping Lily build a puzzle. Slowly, patiently. The cold billionaire from television no longer existed in moments like these. "Batman is cheating," Lily announced seriously. Alexander looked offended. "I am strategically winning. That is rich people language for cheating." Emily laughed softly while setting coffee onto the table. Alexander glanced up at her, and for one quiet moment, everything between them felt frighteningly natural. Like they had somehow built a tiny version of home inside the lonely penthouse. Then Alexander surprised both of them. He placed his hands carefully against the armrests of the wheelchair and slowly pushed himself upward. Emily immediately stepped forward. "Alexander." His legs trembled beneath him, but this time he stayed standing. Not for a second, not for a moment. Longer. Lily's eyes widened. "Mommy." Alexander breathed heavily while gripping the table for balance. Pain still crossed his face, but something stronger appeared too. Determination. Emily moved closer instinctively, ready to catch him if he fell. Alexander looked directly into her eyes while struggling to remain upright. "You asked me why I stopped fighting after the accident," he said quietly. Emily nodded once. "It was because I stopped believing there was anything left worth getting better for." Emotion tightened painfully in Emily's chest. Alexander's voice lowered further. "Then you and Lily walked into my life." Tears filled Emily's eyes before she could stop them. Alexander took one uneven step forward without breaking eye contact. "Doctors tried to fix my body," he whispered. "But you fixed the part of me that wanted to disappear." Behind them, sunlight poured through the giant penthouse windows while Lily smiled quietly from the floor, watching the lonely billionaire finally begin finding his way back to life.